All right, entrance is slowing down a little bit, so I'm going to get started a little bit on some of our housekeeping. Nothing too urgent, but again, welcome to this virtual author visit with the Lincoln Public Library. For any of you who don't know me, my name is Kathryn Hunt, and I have the great good luck to be the director of the Lincoln Public Library. And I'm very excited to welcome our author today, Katie Lattari. For anyone who has not been to one of our author visits before, one of our virtual events before, how this typically goes is Katie and I will be having a conversation about her process and about her work, fantastic novel, Dark Things I Adore, for about 45 minutes. Over the course of this, if you have any questions, please do drop them into the question and answer box in Zoom. If you're on a desktop on Zoom, you'll see that in kind of the bottom toolbar. It looks like two little conversation bubbles, says Q&A. If you place your questions there, it's the easiest place for us to keep track of them. We can either work them into the conversation at the time if it makes sense, or we'll hold about 10-15 minutes at the end to go through the questions. We do also have the chat enabled. Feel free to use the chat if you just want to do a shout out, maybe share with us where you are joining from, particularly if you're outside the greater Lincoln, Sacramento area joining us today. But that Q&A we'll watch the chat as well for questions, but if you drop it in the Q&A, that's the easiest place to make sure we don't miss it. We'll also have a chance at the end, if you are joining by phone, that you can go ahead and dial in to ask your questions. And with that, with no further ado, welcome, Katie. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Kathryn. I'm so excited to be here. It's great.
Fantastic. So yes, and so you just recently released Dark Things I Adore, which I know is often talked about as your debut novel, but it's actually the second long form fiction that you've published, correct?
Yeah, that's true. So Dark Things I Adore is my debut thriller. And then I published a book in 2016 that was sort of more of novella length, and it was sort of a little bit of a quirky literary novel called American Vaudeville. Yeah, there it is.
There it is. So now with this being your debut thriller, what intrigued you to kind of make the switch from the genre of American Vaudeville into a thriller with Dark Things I Adore?
Yeah, so basically I was a person who all through school took sort of writing courses and majored in writing and was doing a lot of different exploring. And once I got out of school, I hit that phase where you're like, well, what kind of writing do I really want to do? And so I started thinking about, well, what is the stuff that what am I consuming? And it was true crime podcasts, and it was thrillers, and it was mysteries. And I said, I should try to write something like that. I should try to write what I love to read. And so Dark Things I Adore kind of came out of that impulse to write something you would want to read yourself.
That's fantastic. So now with a thriller, of course, one of the big pieces and one of the pieces that makes it so enjoyable to read is the twist. And your novel has a number of fantastic twists. And it's always interesting to me when we talk to our thriller authors, how did you kind of come up with the twists? Did you have most of them in mind at the beginning? Did some of them just happen as you were going through? What was kind of your process for figuring out this very kind of twisty mystery that you've got going on?
Yeah, so in the initial drafting, I didn't really know exactly what the twist would be. I wasn't at that time I didn't outline anything, and I just kind of followed a voice and kind of went with that, and it turned into the character of Audra. And so it kind of was the process of true discovery through writing these people. And then as things kind of evolved and kind of the drafting of the book went along and got more complicated, things started to reveal themselves. And then I had to start keeping track. And then, of course, once I got into the revision process with my agent and later my editor, and we were starting to figure stuff out, we asked ourselves questions. What if this happened? What if we took this out? And then you have to kind of adjust and adapt. And then it's a lot of note taking and trying to make sure things dovetail in the right way. So it's a little bit of freestyling kind of in the beginning for me. And then it turns into very sort of like measured, like, okay, we really have to keep track down to make sure everything is making sense.
Absolutely. I imagine that there is a lot of process that goes into as you build that, making sure, as you said, everything dovetails, that you don't leave some thread or loophole at the end.
Exactly.
And I'm sure, were your editors really helpful in making sure that happened, as well as another set of eyes who weren't living in the story the same way you were?
Yeah, that's actually so key. I think, like, as a writer, you spend so much time with your manuscript inside of it and different iterations of it over time. And so it is really helpful to have somebody with much fresher eyes who can look at it a bit more objectively and say, actually, it reads this way to me. And then you're like, oh, does it? And you get these great insights. And so sort of toward the tail end of the drafting, I basically had to keep myself straight with what was going on. I kind of created a Google Sheet database, kind of listing all the scenes and seeing, okay, this is revealed here, so that ripple effects into this and da. So then I kept moving things around to make sure it all worked. And so, yeah, it's super key to have those fresh eyes to sort of help you pick up those threads.
And you mentioned that Audra was kind of the first voice that this novel came out of, but the novel itself is written really in at least 4 voices.
Yeah.
When did you kind of make the turn to decide that you wanted multiple points of view to be telling this story?
Yeah, so I knew pretty early on that I, at the very least, wanted it to be Audra, and then sort of her counterpoint, Max, which is her professor in the book. And just to sort of, for the quick synopsis, is basically Audra is this sort of gifted painting student at the Boston Institute for the Visual Arts, and she's getting her MFA in painting, and she invites her manipulative, kind of problematic professor, Max Durant, up to her remote home in Maine. And so she says, oh, come up, look at my thesis progress, let me know how I'm doing. Max, of course, because he's Max, is like, this girl's into me, this is about hooking up, obviously, this weekend. But Audra secretly has much darker, much more sinister plans in mind, and he just doesn't know it yet. And so that's part of the sort of unraveling of the story. And then there's another timeline set 30 years in the past at this sort of remote eclectic arts camp in remote Maine. And these friends at this art camp start to sort of have their own dark secrets. And then as this book rolls on, you start to see that this timeline from the 1980s and this timeline from the present day are starting to merge into this kind of catastrophe for one of the characters toward the end. And so I knew at the very least that I wanted Audra and Max to have voices in the story. And then it became clear that Coral, who's another character who's more set in the 1980s piece, she needed to have a voice in this as well. And then actually the 4th voice, Juniper, who's set in the 1980s as well, that was a suggestion of my editor. She said, you mentioned in passing this arts camp. The book at that time was just set in the present. She's like, you mentioned in passing this arts camp. What if you like took us there? And I was like, oh boy, that's a lot of work. And then I was like, okay. And so that's what we did. I basically wrote 20,000 new words and took out 20,000 other words and shaped it all back together again. And I'm really glad I did. I think those two sort of timelines kind of coming together really make the story this really beautiful puzzle as it comes together.
I agree. And that's really interesting that Juniper was one of the last voices to come in, because I think she almost has the most she tells almost the entirety of the 1980s storyline.
Yes.
Whereas the present is split between Audra and Max, but we see almost the entirety of what happens at Lupin Valley through Juniper.
Exactly. And so like when that suggestion was made, the kind of the whole ecosystem of the book had a shift from kind of where the focus was, where there was some other subplot lines in the present that were there, and shifted to be more balanced, so that there was a little bit more balance between the past timeline and the present timeline. Yeah.
I think it's fantastic. I think you did a really lovely job with that. But I do, of using the fact that, when we talk about perspective, of course, all of our perspectives are limited. We justify things to ourselves. We miss certain things. We live our lives as narrative creatures every day, kind of telling the story of what we've been through. And so the gaps and discrepancies between those different viewpoints, I think, is one, really important to the story you're telling, but also allows for some of those twists and surprises to happen in really interesting ways.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. But I agree. I feel like stories that structure themselves that way give that, there's this beautiful thing that can happen, because it's so true to life, right? Everybody says the truth is somewhere in the middle, right? You have one person's perception, another person's, the truth is somewhere in the middle. So it's really fun to play with that in a narrative.
Absolutely. So now beyond time, the other thing that's really one of the things that's very central to your book is place. And it takes place in Maine, which is where you are located, correct?
Yes.
And place becomes really important. Like, we have this arts camp, which is located in a specific space. Max is very specifically invited up to Audra's home. These locations matter. And I can't imagine that you can write in any kind of thriller or mystery in Maine without having to confront the specter of Stephen King, kind of laid claim to your state.
Yeah.
Was that something that you did wrestle with? Was that, are you a fan? Are you an anti-fan?
I'm a huge fan of Stephen King, actually. I think he's fantastic. I love his work. He's like a great sort of representative and steward of the state of Maine. Like, he really cares about Maine. He still lives here. He's like super chill. He's really a part of the community, and so I'm a big fan. And so that was certainly a thing that was in the back of my mind, that, like, Maine is, Stephen King central. And so you sort of, but at a certain point too, you're just sort of like, well, I can only write what I can write. I have to just do what I can do. And that's what I tried to do. I feel like Maine is a really compelling place to write about for a lot of reasons. It kind of topographically has everything. It has oceans, it has mountains, it has valleys, it has lakes, it has, it's just, there's so much going on here in terms of just beautiful landscape, and also very remote landscape. I mean, there's true unorganized territory still in Maine. Like, there's no towns, right? So there's a lot here going on to sort of play with. And so I just went in being like, Maine is a great place to write about because of those reasons. It is so beautiful, but it also does, just like the book talks about, they're coming up from Boston, where they go in central Maine, which is pretty remote. By the time you get to Moosehead Lake, it's only 4 hours drive from Boston, but it feels a world away. And that's a really fun thing to play with too. So somebody coming from civilization kind of to this place of real remoteness and wilderness is a fun kind of counterweight, I think.
Absolutely. And I really enjoyed early in the book, I don't think this is any spoilers, but the moment where Max and Audra stop at the gas station, and there you have this beautiful interaction that kind of shows that Max is in fact born and raised outside of this region, that who he is as a person is not informed by this kind of central Maine rural remote mentality in a way that Audra is very comfortable there.
Exactly. Yeah.
So now I know you're in Maine currently. Did you grow up in Maine as well? Or
I did. I mean, I grew up here. I wasn't born here. I was born in Brooklyn, New York, and my family moved to Maine when I was 8. So that was a big change for me. And I think that kind of plays into why I do think Maine is so compelling, because I love Maine so much. It is so beautiful here. It's where I have chosen to live my life. And but I also remember as a kid, coming from Brooklyn, where there's so much going on. There's a lot of people. It's very busy. It's very noisy. There's always lights. And I remember, I think a lot of people, when I came to Maine people were like, "Ooh, New York is scary." And I came to Maine, I was like, "Ooh, Maine is scary because it's dark and there's nobody around. And if something goes down where I live, I'm in trouble." And I think some of that anxiety that I genuinely had as a kid, like when we moved to this really small, one of the first places we lived in Maine is this little tiny town called Exeter, and it's a farming town. And it was far away from stuff, and there weren't a lot of people around. And I remember as a kid, being able to hear a car in the middle of the night coming from a mile away. And something about that as a kid, when you're used to kind of a ton of noise and then having no noise but this one distinct noise, you're like, oh, this is where I get murdered. This is how it happens, right? So as a kid, I had that anxiety. It flipped. Was not anxious in Brooklyn. I was very anxious for a little while as I adapted to Maine and how remote it really can be. And so then of course you get used to it and it's like totally fine here, of course. But it's a big change. So I think that kind of informs some of, why I felt it was perfect to sort of set this story in a place that would feel very separate from Max, who is used to sort of the buzz and glitter of a sort of city.
Absolutely. And with that, he's an urbanite, but he's also a very privileged urbanite. Like we see in the beginning, he's a professor at this institution and all of this, because you mentioned like some people in Maine were like, oh, Brooklyn's scary, and there is a way to talk about urban environments that can be very frightening, that in which other people are kind of the thing that one is frightened of. But I don't think, when we think about Max, I don't think that's really Max's experience of Boston.
Right. Right. Exactly. No, he leans into his privilege for sure. He's like, he loves sort of being a professor at a elite, university and all this stuff. Yeah, for sure.
Very much so. But I thought this is interesting because one of the themes that I've been thinking on as I've, read and thought about your novel is, it's a thriller. There is this thread of violence that runs through it and different kinds of violence. But one of the things that I thought was very interesting is that one of the first major acts of violence that actually takes place is something that growing up rural myself made sense, which was when Audra has to euthanize an injured animal on the side of the road, and that this is an act of violence and it's very disconcerting to Max, but it's not. I was talking to one of our other staff members about this, and it's interesting because to me that falls in kind of this realm of like ethical violence. Like most of us would agree,
right,
you should let something suffer,
right,
which is not the case in all the acts of all the people in your novel. There are plenty of people who act badly and do violence and harm in ways that, as becomes important to the plot, are not seen as justifiable. But I thought it was very interesting that the first act you show on screen is one that is, it's tragic and it's brutal and it's disconcerting.
Right.
But I think, for the most part, we'd agree you should not, Audra should not have let this animal suffer after getting hit by it.
Right. And it is this sort of very interesting moment of sort of opening the aperture to sort of show, a little bit about Audra, that she is comfortable with firearms, that she keeps them close, like all these sort of little things that start to, for Max, who's like, oh boy, who am I spending the weekend with, right? And that she does have an ease with even that sort of violence, right? That it, of course, we learn things about Max and how he has comported himself over the years, and there are different ways we can, define violence, of course, I think. And so it's very viscerally sort of shown in that scene of sort of this mercy killing, as you were talking about. But it is this sort of interesting moment where for Max, things start to be like, oh, like there's this other little edge with Audra that I hadn't really anticipated, that kind of opens the stage, I think, for other things to come.
And I thought it was an interesting window into Max's character because, of course, right before this, he has purchased a knife as a souvenir, which Audra, which we'll find out later for a variety of reasons, she's a little disconcerted about it. But, as a young woman, I too would be disconcerted if a gentleman that I was bringing to my house decided to buy a knife in front of me.
Yeah.
Getting in the car, like totally removed from anything else in the plot. It's a little, But he was totally comfortable with that. But then Audra has a firearm, which is not uncommon in rural areas. In any
exactly.
And he's just like, oh, I'm...
Yeah,
not sure this is good.
Right, exactly. His anxiety shows up pretty quick when that starts to happen.
Absolutely. So I find that I thought you did a really great job of running that thread of violence through, and also the way that we talk about and the roles in which it does, because I know in some other interviews you've talked about the theme of kind of complicity in your novel, but I thought one of the things that was interesting was the way that everyone does, just like in life, really kind of justify their place in the way a variety of terrible things happen between the 1980s and the current. And I don't know whether you have any other thoughts you kind of want to share on that.
Yeah, I just think I would say that, I think, one of the things that became clear as I was writing this book and talking about it with the team at Sourcebooks is that, this is a book where I don't think anybody's hands are completely clean. And I think in a lot of ways that tracks pretty closely to how life really works in a lot of ways. And I think one person's sort of desire for revenge can also be looked at as a need for peace, a certain kind of peace. And so it's just how people sort of define, like you're saying, just how people define things to themselves, rationalize things to themselves, kind of move on with their lives when traumatic things do happen that they are part of as maybe active participants. And I think Juniper is kind of a perfect example where Juniper maybe doesn't do anything directly to anybody. She's not hitting anybody. She's, nothing like that. But she's this person who is seeing a lot of stuff happen. And I think this is the role I think a lot of people find ourselves in small ways most of the time. And if we're unlucky and in big ways where you're seeing something that is not, you sense something is not quite right. But you don't know what to do about it. And so sometimes we don't do anything about it, even though you can sense something's wrong. And I feel like Juniper, for that reason, feels the most, true to life in that way, because I think she's this person who's seeing some unsavory, unfortunate things happen, but is not sure what to do with it. And she's kind of caught in this interesting space of having to grapple with that a little bit.
Absolutely. And I think with that, there's this sense too, with the fact that the 1980s storyline is taking place in this art camp. There's a sense that it's a temporary space. It's a temporary engagement. But of course, we see by the end of your novel that the things that happen in that place, of course, really happen. They continue to have legacies long after. But I think maybe there is a little bit of a sense in some of the characters of, well, it's camp. It's over the summer. We'll all go back to our real lives or move on to our real lives after this.
Yes, I think I totally agree with that. I feel like in so many ways, camps of various kinds have this really sort of mythic place in a lot of people's lives, where there is something sort of larger than life about people who have done summer camps and really love summer camp of various kinds, an arts camp or just any kind of a Boy Scout camp, whatever it is. There's a real sort of connection people have to these spaces that are sort of transient and liminal, and you're not in them for a long time, but the things that happen, they really bond you to the other people who are there, because you're kind of, camps tend to be secluded. They tend to be sort of unto themselves. So you sort of have this enclosed, cloistered ecosystem. And so, people really sort of forge bonds, and tall tales come out of these things. And, oh, did you hear about this thing that happened 720 summers ago, whatever. And I think because of that, it does make a good place for a story like this to unfold, because you're right, there's something that feels not quite real or a little bit larger than life, and you say, well, that's not real life, it's this other thing. And meanwhile, like you said, as the book kind of unfolds, you're like, it's a real, and it has consequences outside of there as well.
And I think in the same way, you did this great thing with having the proprietor of the camp give everyone their camp name.
Yes.
Which, works great as a literary device too, again, to create this space between your two timelines.
Right.
So that kind of questions can unravel and unfold in there. But I also think, with liminal space, I remember, going to summer camp as a child, and you kind of got to be whoever you wanted to be for a time.
Exactly.
You put on a personality. What if I was this person? What if I decided I was a horseback riding person for 2 weeks?
Right.
And I think with the names, there's an even greater sense of that, because, they're not even called the same thing. There is a full identity for themselves there.
Yeah, I think that there's this interesting sense of being encouraged to detach from your life outside of the camp in the book here at Lupin Valley, the Lupin Valley Arts Collective, and to fully embrace this other version of yourself, and to sort of become someone, aspirationally better, of course, and more artistic and more talented and more connected and all these things. But it also, I think, kind of does partition a little bit of conscience a little bit for some of these people in an interesting way. Yeah. So there is this sort of baptism through the naming, I think, that happens for people.
And you've got some characters, though, who push against that. You do have some characters who are quote unquote townies, and don't get to stay in a cabin. They have to go back to their real lives with their real names at 5 p.m. when work's done. And I think those are a really nice foil to kind of push on that tension of.
Yeah, I agree. I think it was really important to sort of exactly to be like, there's people who work there as their job, and they go home, and there is, the real world is this close, it's not this close where you can kind of imagine, oh, I'm, far away from everything. They're this close. They go home, they have to feed their dog and pay their bills and all the other things. Right. And I think that, there's that tension of the people who are serving others at Lupin Valley and the people being served at Lupin Valley. And then sort of some of the static that can happen when friendships are formed in that space. And people are not thoughtful about being served by their friends in certain cases and not being thoughtful about that.
And what those power dynamics look like.
Yeah, exactly.
How that plays out later.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, so the other really interesting thing I thought with your novel was you have these written descriptions of theoretical artworks.
Right.
And I'm really curious about your process in terms of visioning these artworks and then making the decision of how to portray them with words, and portraying something that's fundamentally visual or supposed to be visual, and something that isn't a visual medium.
Yeah. So I was like, well, this is a little bit of a, we'll see if this works. It's a little bit of a risk, but yeah, I really liked, I don't consider myself a visual artist. I don't have a lot of talent in that direction, but I have a lot of admiration for visual artists of various kinds, whether they're painters or sculptors or photographers or whatever. I love the idea of trying to take paintings that I feel like paintings can be really visceral and really compelling instantaneously, right? As soon as you see them, they kind of hit you all at once, and then you can kind of look at the different parts as well. And I thought that there was something really amazing and sort of dreamy and full of possibilities about that, and trying to render that in language. And so part of it was just the challenge of it was kind of a fun thing to think about. And then the other part was, I think I've talked about this a little bit in other spaces, but I think I have a little bit of a touch of synesthesia, which is sort of where you have a crossing of senses. And so sometimes I experience a sound as like a flavor and things like that. And, people have very different experience of what synesthesia is, but it's basically the basic definition is that you have a crossing of the senses when you're experiencing one sense, basically. And so I was like, I feel like I can use that to my advantage. It really plays well into creative writing. And so I wanted to sort of try to do that and then layer in the found objects, which are a little note, they're, supposed to be little notes that Coral has left behind, and sort of create this, these thesis paintings that are supposed to be Audra's thesis paintings, the very paintings that Max has been asked up to Maine to look at and view. And they have kind of these hidden secret messages that are meant for Max, of course, is what we learn as time goes on.
Well, and I thought the inclusion of the collage with the notes is really brilliant from also just a writerly perspective, because of course, any work of visual art that has, written elements or language in, you have to get in and read. You can't get the full impression from across the room. There is kind of an immediate visual, but then there's also the reading process. And I think including those, one, we learn very interesting things through what is embedded in these thesis paintings.
Yeah.
But also, they kind of unfold in your descriptions in a way that is analogous to what they would if we were able to see them in a gallery.
Yeah, that's very lovely. Thank you for saying that. Yeah, I was like, this is, going to be interesting because it's differently, the temporality of it, of course, works slightly differently, of course, with reading versus sort of taking it in visually in front of you. But yeah, I thought it would be an interesting thing to try. And I think, it's fairly effective the way it is. So hopefully readers find it to be that way.
Well, I know I enjoyed it personally, coming out of an art background. Let's see. So now with that, so you do have, the title of thesis work, the title of each of those paintings. I had heard that there is a story about you submitting originally this novel under a different name itself.
Yeah. So basically when I was drafting this novel and when I put it out to, sent it out to try to query for an agent, the novel was titled The Agony Record. And then through some chatting with my agent, she thought that might be a little too intense sounding. It might sound like a horror novel or something like that. And so then when we sent it off to publishers, it was actually called Benefaction. So that's not, obviously that's not the final title. And then when we got to working with Source Books, we were brainstorming and they came to me with Dark Things I Adore. And I said, oh, well, that's perfect. Of course, that's very good.
Well, I thought that's great because that ties in because the series of thesis paintings is called Her Dark Things, correct?
Correct.
So I thought there was a nice overlap with those, which
Yes, it all kind of came together once we kind of figured out, okay, what's the overall book going to be called, and how can we tie that into the structure of the novel as well? And then it really did dovetail really nicely.
beautiful. So now, before we got started, you and I were talking a little bit, and you mentioned that this book spent quite a bit of time in revision.
Mm-hmm.
About how long were you living with this story as you were writing it, though? Was this something, I know you mentioned that it started with Audra's voice, but how long was it kind of kicking around as you were writing it?
I would say in terms of like from the time I started drafting it to like when I felt I had a fully formed draft that I felt like I couldn't do more with on my own, which is not to say it was done by any means, but just more like I don't have any more forward vision for this at this time. The full first draft of the book took about a year, probably 12 or 14 months to draft. And then as I was talking to you about earlier, and then once I was fortunate enough to land an agent, we went through an intensive revision process for about a year, because it takes, 2 or 3 months for the agent to read it and get back to you with their thoughts. And then it takes me 2 or 3 months to actually act on all those thoughts. And then you go back a couple times, and that took about a year. And then the same thing basically happened once it sold to Source Books. And I went through about another year of revisions in a very similar mode, where it took a couple months at a time going each way. And then we felt like we were ready. We were there.
Well, and it's fantastic. So that's a pretty quick turnaround. Honestly, it sounds like, sometimes we hear, particularly with people who are earlier in their writing careers, that, like, oh, these characters have lived with me for a decade and it's finally come out, or various things like that. So I think that's incredible that kind of Audra's voice in these characters kind of came out and kind of had their story for you.
Yeah, it's a good point, because I think I kind of like got a little self-conscious with like how much revision I had to do. I was like, oh gosh, like maybe, whatever. But I think it's true that I think once I kind of gave myself permission to write the kind of book I wanted to write, which is a thriller, I was like, the story came pretty quickly in terms of the premise and the people who I knew I wanted to have populate it. And so then it was just sort of fine-tuning where we should really be focusing and whose voice should have more primacy and things like that. So I was really fortunate that the story kind of came as quickly as it did. Yeah.
So are you working on the next one? Do you have any ideas for what you want to do next?
Yeah, so I actually have a next book drafted, and that is with my agent right now, and sort of we're in that phase of trying to figure out what happens next for submission and things like that. So I'm hopeful that it will find a home. I'm really excited about it. I really like it. So hopefully, fingers crossed, that'll land somewhere. And then, since that is at that'll probably need some revision as well. And then, once I'm through that phase, I will, work on another one. But yeah, there is another one in the holster, as they say.
Fantastic. Another thriller?
Another thriller.
Also set in Maine, or?
Also set in Maine, this time on the coast, though. This is sort of a lake town, central Maine story. And then the next book is a coastal Maine story.
Very nice. Very nice. So fewer moose in this next one.
Fewer moose. That is accurate.
Well, fantastic. Well, I hope that process goes smoothly and creatively, and that finds a good home.
Thank you. That's really sweet. I hope so too. I am excited about it.
Absolutely. And then what are you reading right now?
So actually right now I am reading a Stephen King book. I'm reading Billy Summers, the new one. And then I'm also reading Blacktop Wasteland by S.A. Cosby. And other recent reads have been Good Neighbors by Sarah Langan, which is like so good. It's kind of insane. I think those are sort of the recent ones, that I've been doing.
Very nice. Very nice. I know a lot of times we get questions from our participants by our library members on, what books would you recommend? Not just ones you've read recently, but what are some books that you love or that you'd share with our group?
So here's books that have really sort of like stuck out to me and stuck with me over the years. One would be The Kind Worth Killing by Peter Swanson. That's a thriller. A non-thriller, more of a sort of literary fiction novel, is The Overstory by Richard Powers, which is sort of a big book that's incredibly beautiful and sweeping, and I was like so moved by it, and I thought it was gorgeously written, so I really loved that. An older book sort of from the early, sort of part of the 1900s, I think it's a sort of a modernist novel by Juna Barnes called Nightwood. It's a very different kind of book. It's not a thriller. It's sort of a pretty heady literary novel, but it's so gorgeously written that I just like find it's delicious and like amazing. So those three are really great. There's so many good books. It's so hard. But those are a couple that spring to mind right away, I would say.
I love your description of that modernist novel as deliciously written, because I know one of the things that stood out to me in your novel was your word choice in some places, because we talk a lot with thrillers about plot and pacing.
Yes.
But I was so glad you didn't open with a chapter from Max's point of view, because Max has such a distinctive voice, and the language you use for him is so, especially when he's thinking about women, is so over the top.
Mm-hmm.
He gives, I felt such a visceral sense of the character before he'd done anything just with, the thing that stood out to me was his description of Audra's eyebrows as,
yes,
bold, but never brutish. Like,
right.
Thanks, dude.
And he would be the kind of guy who would absolutely like analyze women like to the nanometer, and he would call it art. He would call it sort of the artist's eye, but it's just him being like, a pervy perv, basically. You know what I mean? So, but it's him taking it all in and being very grandiose about it all. But it's like, no, you're just maybe one of those guys,
Yeah, you're just having an opinion on somebody's body.
Yeah, exactly.
An opinion about.
Yeah.
But I thought I really thought that was great at the beginning, down to the word choice. Because again, with thrillers, a lot of times we talk about plot, which is super important to keep it moving, and you had this great kind of tense story and where is it going next. But even just from the beginning, the sense of your different voices were very much different voices, down to
great. That's great to hear.
What they think about, but how the language they use to think about it. You could tell Max has been through an MFA and spent a lot of time thinking his own thoughts and how.
Yes, that is such a good description of Max. He's thinking of, he spends a lot of time thinking about his own thinking. That is so true. That's perfect.
Someone will think I'm brilliant when I say this in lecture. But yeah, so Max is just he's an interesting character. He's so humanly, I don't want to say despicable, but a little despicable in certain things. I know, the whole I'm going to elevate my students with my inappropriate advances. Is unfortunate.
He puts himself on a pedestal. And he's like, wouldn't you be so blessed if I deigned to bring you up here with me, as if he has any real power or influence, but he really believes that he does, and so that's like the headspace that he lives in, and so it's interesting to see a guy like that. I think one of the things that's really interesting to watch between Max and Audra is that both of them are 100% feel that they are 100% sure about what they're doing. Both of them think that they know exactly what's going on, but only one of them is right, kind of, right? And Audra has some stuff that she kind of learns and figures out too, but both of them have the certitude of I don't know, they both really believe in themselves, but they have, they're not always right about that, but they're both totally sure about what their experience is.
Yeah, I love in the beginning, Max is opining, it's like, oh yes, it's definitely this weekend's going to go the way I think it's going to go.
It's
so clear in everything she does. We go right into Audra's point of view, and she's just like, well, I know how he thinks this weekend is going to go.
Right. Exactly.
But yeah, brilliant. So often we have aspiring writers in our group. Do you have any words of advice for anyone who has that novel inside them that they're working on?
Yeah, so I have a couple things. They're kind of like broad, but I think they were actually some of the key things that through honestly like a lot of therapy and like talking it out with people that I finally came to realize, and it's so true. But one is truly write the book that you want to write. Oh my God, I cannot overstate this enough. Like, don't write what you think people want you to write. Don't write what you think people want you to read, or what you think people want to read. Write something you would want to read. Do what you want to do. That's number one. Number two is don't feel like you have to write in a certain way. I know that there's this sort of like very, I don't know, like precious thought about if you're not writing every day, you're not serious and you're not a writer. And I think that's BS, honestly. Like, we're people with jobs and lives, and like that doesn't always work for people. If you're a person who that works for, like, Godspeed and God bless, and I salute you. I am not that person. I write when I can, when I have a moment, when I am inspired to. Sometimes I don't write for a couple of weeks. Sometimes I don't write for a couple of months. It really depends. So just like let yourself find your own rhythm. Whatever your rhythm is, it is correct as long as you are writing. It's totally cool. And then stick to itiveness is, I think, the biggest one, honestly. It's sort of like, I think if you are a person especially who does have designs on publishing traditionally, let's say, stick to itiveness. It's a little bit of a war of attrition. Keep going, keep writing, keep producing. You will get better. It just is how it works. I have written many things, many words, many pages, some better than others, a lot better, all that kind of stuff. So just keep doing it. It's like anything else. Just put the time in and like keep going. Just keep going.
Absolutely. And I love what you say about not doing it every day. As someone who's terrible at daily habits personally, there is a lot of discussion of, well, if you don't lose your mind, if you don't get your 10 pages down every day, then.
Yeah, I don't subscribe to that. I don't think it's realistic. And I think it puts a lot of pressure on people to have to do art a certain way. And I don't think anybody should feel like they have to do art a certain way. I don't think that's a thing.
Well, and especially for people who have other obligations. I mean, yeah. When, all your paychecks come from your advances on the novels, then.
Yeah, that's a lovely world for some people. And if I was doing that, boy, I'd be writing every day. But that's not the world most writers live in. And that's okay. There's no shame in having a day job and like writing on the weekends and at night and all that stuff. That's how most writers do it. So just keep doing you. That's what I would say.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, we're about 15 minutes from the hour. And so I'm going to check our questions. I don't see anything in our Q&A. If any of our attendees have questions, now is the time to start dropping them in. I know we do have a comment from Linda, who also was effusive about how clever it was to give the art camp students their specific camp names to kind of pull apart the ability to collapse those two narratives and figure out whether there are any overlaps between our characters. And that she's been recommending that widely, which I can agree. I too have been recommending it widely. Everyone's going to deal with me, talking about it as I've been reading it.
It was really fun coming up with those camp names too. Trust me, it was really fun.
Well, and I really enjoyed jumping on your Instagram the other day and seeing that you had created a Valley camp name. So if anyone's interested in that, you can jump on Katie's Instagram. I think it's probably down from our story. We reposted it on ours, but
yeah, it is. Yeah, it's just in my picture feed somewhere. So if you at Katie Lattari on Instagram, and it'll be there, and you can find out what your camp name would be and what camp you'd be living in on this little generator thing.
I believe I was at Cobweb, I believe is my Lupin Valley name.
I love it.
I believe I'm in Medium, but I would have to double check again.
I love it. Yeah, I'm Onyx, and oh gosh, I forgot what my cabin was. Oof, I forget, but my camp name would be Onyx.
I like that. Yeah, it's a good one. It is funny, the camp names also, this is a total tangent, but do remind me, my university where I went to its first decade back in the 1920s and 30s, it was traditional that everyone got a nickname their freshman year, and that's what they referred to for 4 years. So there's interesting all these logs and documents from the first kind of decade of the college, and you'll just see just these strange like, puppy was here. And that's just what someone went by for 4 years was puppy.
That is fascinating. Oh, I love that. I love that it was like institutionalized to that level. That's incredible.
Yeah, it was a delight. So, but yeah, I'm not seeing any questions coming in. So I am curious. You mentioned a little bit some different kinds of camps. What were some of the influences on your conception of what Lupin Valley looked like?
Yeah, I just was, honestly, I had never been to like an overnight camp. I'm not a person who ever experienced that, but of course, it's all over like pop culture, But I was thinking of a place where there'd be this mix of this sort of almost like a monkishness, sort of like very serious, like these kind of sort of ascetically, sort of like simple cabins where there's a potbelly stove and a simple bedroll and a little desk. And I like the idea of that kind of like sort of pure space for these artists to come. But that's the sort of inner sanctum of the cabin. But then outside is this sort of pretty whimsical split place where the art has been sort of incorporated into the landscape and is on the outsides of buildings and is incorporated into the trees and things like that. So I like this idea of these they're mostly adults, like nobody's younger than like 19 who would go to this camp or whatever, basically in the book anyway. And this idea of these people who are coming to do some serious kind of study, but then they're also getting to be sort of kids again a little bit too. So that kind of meat of like being a little self-serious, but then being like, oh, let's like go sleep in a hammock, like in a tree, and like paint, each other's bodies out by the campfire. That kind of like whimsicalness I thought whimsy would be really fun to bring together. So it was just sort of like, I was like, if I were to go to one of these, this is kind of what I would want it to be like. I'd want it to be really vibrant and colorful and kind of a little bit anything goes, I guess.
I can absolutely see that. It's funny. I was wondering whether you'd been referencing in part, there was a arts college, Black Mountain College, back in the 60s that like John Cage and a bunch of people went to and did exactly this. They did stuff that became major art, but it was also like, hey, what if we just drove a truck on a piece of paper for like 60 feet and called it art?
Right. That is very much the spirit, I would say. Very much the spirit of this. Yeah, exactly.
No, it sounds like a great time. If you ever decide to found Lupin Valley,
you'd come and stay, you'd come and hang out.
I would come and stay. I would do my best to not act like most of the characters in your novel.
Right, exactly.
Let everybody go home at the end of summer and,
correct.
Beyond, other than that, it sounds fantastic.
Yeah, exactly. We'll take some of the dark elements out. It'll just be swimming in the lake and all that kind of stuff,
Exactly.
Yeah.
Painting, some swimming, absolutely. Well, brilliant. Well, I'm going to do a last call for questions. Likewise, if you'd rather dial in and ask your question, go ahead and just press *9 on your phone if you're on a phone to raise your hand. Otherwise, you can raise your hand in Zoom and we can connect that way. Otherwise, with that, again, Katie Lattari's novel is Dark Things I Adore. It is fantastic. It is available at the Lincoln Public Library in hard copy, as well as if you are a Hoopla user, you can get the ebook through Hoopla. You can also pick it up at any local bookstore. Go to bookshop.org if you want to find a local bookstore, or if you are familiar with our partner up in El Dorado Hills, Face in a Book, you can also get it through them, through their web portal, and support this fantastic author. And Katie, thank you so much for spending your time this evening with us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Thank you to you. Thank you to Sam. This has been like super lovely. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Absolutely. And we look forward to hopefully when your next book gets published, this one that's in the holster, hopefully we can have you back over Zoom and talk about that one as well.
I would be delighted. Please, let's.
Fantastic. Well, with that, we'll go ahead and let you go. Thank you everyone for attending and have a great rest of your evening, Katie.
You too. Have a good one.
Bye.
Bye.